Hi, this is Andy Revkin. I write the .Earth blog for the New York Times, and I'm blogging heads with Abrahm Lustgarten, who writes about energy and environment for ProPublica, which, if I remember correctly, just won a Pulitzer Prize. Is that correct?
It did, for great reporting by my colleagues Jesse Eisinger and Jake Bernstein.
Yeah, but actually, let's just talk briefly about this newish, not so new now, journalism model. How's it all going?
Well, it's going great. I mean, we're having a lot of fun. We're a nonprofit. We focus on investigative reporting, and it opens up a whole lot of opportunities, like being able to spend 2 or 3 years on a single project or a single story. And it's been a really creative place, and a lot of great minds and really solid experience that have come here. So it's been a lot of fun so far.
Wow, well, boy, I'll tell you, the idea of focusing on one thing for a couple of years is pretty appealing. And
it has its pluses and negatives, I suppose.
Yeah, the New York Times, of course, is going through its own little experiment with a new model, and so far my blog traffic hasn't dropped off, even though we have this subscription wall that people are facing. So I guess
100,000 subscribers today. Is that what we hear?
I don't know. Is that right? Is that right?
I saw that number batted around a little bit. Yeah. Progress, I guess.
Stay tuned is the operative term these days. So your project personally these days has been gas. Is that fair to say?
It has. It's the first big thing that I picked up after starting here a couple of years ago, and I've stayed on it for a couple of years. So we started looking at the natural gas boom and its effect on water quality back in 2008, and it led to a lot of investigation into this process of hydraulic fracturing. Since then, as the issue has kind of picked up steam, I've been moving on to a couple of other things, but it's still a big focus here.
And how would you summarize the state of this, I guess we can call it this portion of the gas industry?
The fracking?
Yeah,
portion?
the hydraulic fracturing, the shale.
Yeah, well, it's fracking says technology that makes it possible to access these large reserves of natural gas in the country in a way that we haven't been able to easily before. When that happens at the same time that we're desperate to find new and domestic energy resources, and we happen to have a lot of natural gas, it really pushes for quick implementation and a quick pursuit of whatever technology, including fracturing, makes it possible. Part of what we've been looking at is what kind of repercussions there are for going too quickly in that direction, and whether there are environmental impacts from the process, and we found that there are. So now it's really a discussion about how can you minimize those impacts, and how can you smartly go forward and pursue natural gas or put it in its appropriate place in the energy portfolio.
Yeah, and the discussion, like so many things I see these days, seems to end up being distilled down to no fracking versus yes, and the usual folks highlighted in the debate are the industry and in this case sort of mostly regional environmental campaigners or property owners. Do you still get the sense that that's the way this is generally playing out? Because one thing I keep noting to people who use the word no a lot is, so what do you say yes to?
Right. Unfortunately, I think that is how it plays out in a lot of communities. There is a shrill component here, and I think it actually goes along with a little bit of a misunderstanding about what fracking is and about what its role is in this broader drilling process and how it relates to other risks associated with drilling. But that said, there are very real risks to water resources, and apparently we're learning more recently to air resources, and there's some fine balance, I think, that needs to be struck between people appropriately considering those and still staying productive and open-minded about how to incorporate development of those resources, and not just sort of shutting down and fighting, as you say, any development at all. So.
Yeah, especially now with the recent the EIA, the IEA. I always get them mixed up. No, actually, it was the Energy Information Administration did this global map of shale gas, estimating simply vast quantities, including in Western Europe, which I assume as they keep looking at the pipeline dependency they had from Russia all these years, they would love to sort of take away that choke point. I don't know whether it looks basically inevitable that there will be a substantial expansion of this resource. One other thing that I noted recently was I was talking to someone at Oklahoma State University maybe 6 months ago, and and I was asking about what's up with China, and they don't have a lot of conventional gas, so and they said, well, there's a delegation of Chinese engineers here who are learning how to frack. And they have, if you look at that, again, the global gas resource, China's clearly eager to look at this too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they have a lot of shale gas resources. They've had a couple conferences lately on shale gas stimulation techniques, which is what fracking's called. It actually was possibly going to be involved in some of them. But you can definitely expect China to start fracking, if you will, but to start developing their natural gas resources. And the same with Europe. I mean, what in some ways a fantastic opportunity to unshackle themselves from that pipeline tether to Russia. And the same thing with the United States. I mean, there's clearly benefits to developing natural gas. We clearly need to find an array of energy to pursue. I think the question really is just how do you do that safely and responsibly, and how long is it appropriate to how much debate is appropriate to not get stuck in the rut of kind of saying no new wind farms, no new gas drilling, right, no new nuclear plants, and how much is appropriate to actually identify what the risks are and make smart decisions about how to handle them.
Yeah, maybe we'll talk about water first, because I think that was a big chunk of your initial focus. Mm-hmm. And what's your sense of the kind of the Gasland portrayal of this, the flaming faucets and all that, in terms of is that an aberration or is that a norm? And do you expect that the EPA study that's underway could help clarify in a meaningful way sort of best practices, worst practices, what really are the risks? Or are we going to sort of remain in an area of where kind of assertion dominates over statistical analysis?
Well, I have very high hopes for the EPA study, but I'm not sure that with the budget that they're putting towards it and the amount of time they're giving themselves, that they'll really have solid answers. And I've talked to a lot of the EPA folks out in Wyoming and Colorado who are looking at this, and it's very hard to, as you know well, and it's very hard to draw conclusive, answers to these questions at all. So there'll be some ambiguity still going forward, but I hope that the EPA study, the national study, can help at least clarify things. I mean, the Gasland, it's become the image for this issue across the country. A lot of the places that Josh Fox went and filmed were the same places that I'd spent a lot of time reporting, and with a lot of the same characters. Generally, I think that the film is accurate, though it was clearly assembled in a way that tugged at your heartstrings and omitted certain nuances, which in some cases is unfortunate. But this issue of tap water burning, it happens. It's happened in 6 or 7 of the places that I've been, and we've been looking a lot at methane migration underground as kind of an indicator that if methane can move underground, then anything else can move underground, at least in theory. The next step, of course, is to test the theory, and that's where maybe the EPA study can bring some answers, to those questions. But there's really no doubt if you go to communities like Bradford, Pennsylvania, or Dimock, Pennsylvania, or out to Pavilion, Wyoming, where these rural places where the drilling is happening, that it's affecting people, that their water is damaged, that their air is worse, that they don't feel good, they don't, linking epidemiological problems with pollution is always dangerous territory. I mean, it's very hard to do that, but there's no question that something's happening, and so hopefully this is the start of at least asking what is happening and trying to put some protections in place that might minimize it.
And was it Wyoming that has clamped down somewhat? I'm just trying to remember. State by state, there are some moves afoot to start to force industry disclosure of what's being used, that kind of thing.
Yeah, Wyoming's among the states that have changed the regulations a little bit in the last 2 years as this issue is kind of percolated up. Last year they passed a regulation requiring disclosure of the chemicals in the fracturing fluids, which has been a real problem. EPA scientists say that they can't go out and test water because they don't know exactly what to test for, and there's been partial disclosure, but not complete disclosure. And Wyoming's joined Colorado and Pennsylvania and a couple other states, New York, I believe, in requiring that disclosure. The next step is to see how they met out the various exemptions that are still available, and whether it becomes a thorough reporting process and whether it's effective and useful information. But Wyoming, like a lot of these other drilling states, is definitely responsive to the uptick in concerns that have been expressed.
Now, one of my go-to people on methane, natural gas as a resource, an energy resource for many years, is Jesse Ausubel at Rockefeller University. When I did my latest piece on this, I asked him, it was right after the EIA, the Energy Department assessment of global shale gas, and he was a little more reserved on whether this was the gas age, meaning that the shale resource was the thing. He still says that there's so much new conventional gas coming online, like these amazing fields off of Israel in the Mediterranean, that doesn't necessarily mean this technique still requires so much sort of dispersed drilling that we may still see, in terms of price, controlling what happens or doesn't happen, conventional gas still being a big chunk of production. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, first of all, the thing about fracking is it's used in all gas wells, and it's used in all oil wells. The conversation tends to get sort of tracked towards these new shale gas developments in the Marcellus and the Haynesville and stuff like that. But it's just as relevant in a conventional shale development, or a conventional gas development. It just might not involve as much volume of chemicals. But absolutely. The gas markets are in total upheaval, kind of waiting to see what happens in the United States, whether we will import or if we'll export, and how those will affect international markets. And Russia has extraordinary natural gas deposits as well.
Yeah, in 2009, I did this page one story and a series of blog posts after looking at the other issue that's germane right now, which is leakage, not into water supplies, but into the air of, literally, many billions of cubic feet, if not trillions, of methane, which again is the main constituent of natural gas. And what I wrote at that time was that it's a no-brainer to stanch nearly all of these emissions, including the ones that come at the point when you're completing the process of drilling a well. And oddly enough, it was BP that was the industry leader. They had taken all their fields in New Mexico and cut emissions 99% of these. Right. But keeping the pipeline. And what I wrote at that time was on .earth was, this is the one greenhouse gas that's a commodity already. You don't have to put a price on it. There already is a price on it. And yet industry was still not doing much about it. And so this gets to this new point that the Hoarth et al. Paper out of Cornell and other assertions that there's a big climate component to the concerns people should have about natural gas or not. I don't know how closely you've tracked that question.
Yeah, well, I've looked at Hoarth's research, and I did a little reporting on this last July, kind of building on the piece that you mentioned, looking at the EPA's estimates of fugitive emissions. There's this assumption that gas is a good choice because it's 50% cleaner than coal and dramatically cleaner than oil. And when you look at the amount of methane emissions or fugitive emissions that are out there, I think it's valid to start questioning whether the assumption still holds, and that's what we tried to do. And that's what Hoarth ultimately did. We reached slightly different conclusions, and there's lots of vagueness and lots more questions and research to be done here. But we found that 50% window might be 20%, 30%, depending on how efficient the plant is that's actually burning the gas in the end when you account for the fugitive methane. And Hoarth, he's alleging that gas might actually be dirtier than coal. He throws a whole bunch of assumptions into that, and while it's an interesting prospect, I don't know yet if it can be said with any certainty. He figures a dramatically higher factor of intensity for the methane than the EPA does or the federal government does, and that makes a big difference in whether you say it's a worse or better polluter. But it definitely, to me anyway, the question when you look at that on top of the potential water pollution and the other risks, of drilling it definitely changes the decisions that we as a public are making. I think when we evaluate whether we want natural gas to be our next fuel or whether we want nuclear to be our next fuel, if the goal is to reduce emissions and positively affect climate change, then finding out that gas, for all of the investment it would take and all the other risks to water and so forth, would only make an incremental difference, that might alter the policy decisions that are made going forward. What do you think as you read Haworth's research?
Well, one thing that disturbed me and some of the scientists I consulted was the big gap in the definitiveness of his abstract and summary and the actual paper, which the paper is quite clear at expressing the uncertainties in several parts of the calculations. The other thing, of course, is the subjective decision in choosing a time frame for how you compare the greenhouse heating from methane to CO2. When you talk to climatologists charting this question of what to do about global warming, there's very few of the veterans in that field who say that a short time frame, in other words, the one that makes methane look more important, the 20-year time frame, that's really worth focusing on very much, because in the end, it's the long haul picture of global warming, which is mostly delineated by the long lifetime of CO2, carbon dioxide, and not by methane, that determines the sort of the momentousness of what we're doing to the climate system. Now, again, even there's differences, although I find they're mostly they're value judgments more than scientific judgments.
Right.
And that, again, it's fine as long as that's expressly clear in the way something is stated, and sometimes that's not so clear. So that bugs me a little bit. And I've seen the same kind of disconnect between the uncertainties in a paper and the language in abstracts and summaries many, many times in the climate literature over the years. I wrote about another example recently where, and the scientists say, well, we all know how to read a paper. We know that the summary is always more definitive than you have to look at the details. And the problem is that what they don't recognize or aren't willing to admit is that there's another audience for that paper. Now it's the media and the public, and unless that, if you say something is definitive, the way I grew up, that means you're saying it's definitive. And so it's like reading a contract. You're looking, or a reporter's always looking for the clearest statement of the findings, and if it's one way in one place and one way in another, that can be a problem.
Right.
Now, by the way, and overall, again, I personally see it's really hard to take gas off that, as you have a trajectory toward decarbonization of the global energy menu. To my mind, it's really impossible to take gas off that menu. It's quite clear to me that if you have best practices for getting it out of the ground, and I've seen them up close, and it's a remarkable difference between best and worst practices. That you can have a very valuable fuel that has a lot of attributes that will be favorable in the decades to come.
Yeah, I tend to agree 100%. I think the question is, and what I think about after some of my reporting is how much can the industry be trusted to implement those best practices on their own?
Exactly.
Can their word be taken for what it is, or are more steps needed? A variety of steps to make sure that those best practices are implemented, and also if we're going to develop the gas or any other resource, if it's mining, for example, I mean, how can we plan it in a way that is responsible, that it happens in designated places where we're prepared for the impacts, and maybe it doesn't happen in places that we decide collectively shouldn't be touched by that sort of development.
Yeah, and by the way, in this instance, I haven't seen much evidence from the gas and oil industry that they're ready to sort of ramp it up on on best practices. In other words, in stating explicitly that their policy is to have the BP style of extraction for gas. In 2009, I asked the American Petroleum Institute what is the deal? What is your choice for best practices for limiting fugitive emissions? And at that time, they really didn't have a clear way of stating their goals. And what you'll see if you continue with the sort of what's happened, which is this kind of free range, door-to-door salesman approach to getting the leases and then not being very responsible about dealing with problems when they erupt and not clamping down on your own worst practices, that's going to lead to a much more sort of regulatory style clampdown, which and a lot of public distrust, which I don't think will be beneficial to anybody.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, the industry needs some certainty, regulatory certainty, and a degree of public support to go forward. And you know, if what's going to happen is that the exploitation of the resource is going to get ramped up, you know, kind of go into big time mode, then you'd think some certainty is going to give them the stability to make more money. That it's in their interest as well to kind of settle on a standard regime and come to some agreement with the public and with the government about how to do this. And yet to see that happen. And you mentioned with the methane, with the fugitive emissions, that the best practices are known. The techniques for capturing the emissions are not only profitable, but are also known, and somehow they're still not they're not universally put in place, or not even broadly put in place. So. You know, that I stumble on that continues to baffle me a little bit.
Well, I heard up close. I mean, basically, it's a cultural thing. It really, it's a corporate culture. BP, you know, whatever you think about BP's handling of oil, through the 2000s, still sort of resonating off of what John Brown pushed the company to do in the late 90s, there was an imperative to cut emissions that contributed to climate change. And there were one or two people, literally, a couple guys, who would periodically circle through the oil and gas areas to look for how they've been doing. And they got to New Mexico, an area that I focused on, and said, around 2004, they said, "Oh, you cut emissions 50%. That's great. Why did you stop?" And they ended up going to 99% reduction. So, and I heard from many people in the industry that essentially the culture still in the industry overall is drill, baby, drill. It's so much more production. Adding new production is far more important than stanching old leaks.
Right.
And even though it's profitable, as you said, you know, very clearly, EPA has made that clear in their methane to markets program too. So we'll see. I have a feeling the culture will be forced to shift a little bit if they stick with the same as it ever was.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what do you think? You have, you know, taking a step back and you're looking at a variety of energy sources and a, you know, a broad array of needs, of course. I mean, how do you see the brouhaha around gas drilling and the controversy around that, comparing to the fears about nuclear energy after the Fukushima accident in Japan, and you know, and the clear drawbacks that we could list to every single energy source that we want to talk about? How does what do you see, and how does one go and make that decision about which risks they're willing to accept?
It's I don't see an imminent prospect of an end to the culture of. Tom Friedman has been echoing. I can't remember who came up with banana. This is the build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything successor to NIMBY. That, you know, the chances we're going to get past those kinds of impediments are for the sake of broader imperatives like getting off of oil dependence is fairly low, because people still culturally always look at the local risk with more passion than they do the global responsibility or risk. And that's a tough thing. One thing I try to write about as much as I can on .earth is the cultural and behavioral realities that shape how we respond to risk. And we have a very variegated, within any population of human beings, you'll find people who are fundamentally have different ways of defining how much is too much, whether it's radiation or you know, a level of risk related to gas extraction. Right. And I just, by the way, just today, I just came out of the bowels of the Indian Point nuclear power plant. I went on a three-hour tour, including in the spent fuel pool. I didn't go swimming in it, but I was standing there looking down at the entire energy history of the Indian Point 3 power plant was there below me in these racks in the greenish water, all the fuel they've used since 1976. And the second reactor, they're already moving the fuel into these dry casks, which are pretty impossible to break, and could stand the test of time. Don't they get around this question of where do you put it? Where's the Yucca Mountain at the perfect place? And but there'll be people, probably including my spouse, realistically, who won't see that necessarily as acceptable risk as well. So I think we have to get comfortable with the reality that we're always going to have very different personal reactions to these things, and somehow develop policy that can reflect that. Not there's as a journalist, and I'm sure you share the same hope that information can matter. If you just put out accurate reports and write them compellingly, people will go, aha.
Right.
But it doesn't always happen that way. And,
right.
So we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah, there seems to be a real unwillingness to even acknowledge that any risk is appropriate. I've been the Gulf spill has had me thinking. I'm writing a book about BP now, and one of the things that's come up besides their culpability and all the other parties involved is simply this question of whether the public expects that any spilled oil, that any risk whatsoever is appropriate in the production of oil. And I think the same thing goes, if you want to talk about Indian Point or you want to talk about natural gas expansion. There's a general feeling out there that people are entitled to the power that runs their gadgets and runs their homes without having to accept any kind of financial, environmental impacts, and that's maybe the biggest thing that I see people kind of coming to terms with, or having to face up to. That some sort of impact is part of the game that we all signed in on, and the next step is to figure out where your thresholds are, and a little more honestly maybe than we have in the past.
Yeah, well, I look forward to reading that book. I did this piece last year during the heart of the Gulf Gusher, where I paused from day after day writing about the oil and the deaths and everything, and I kind of went down to my basement in this old house we live in, and reflected on a couple of years ago we had the oil tanks. We have heating oil in the Hudson Valley, like almost everybody around us, and they had gotten rusty, and we were poised to replace them or not. And I thought, oh, we can get geothermal. I looked at the price, no way. And and so we ended up buying new oil tanks. And so I wrote this piece called "Oil, Inertia, and the Energy Quest," noting that some part of that spill is I have ownership of some part of that, and that we were too quick to always be pointing the finger at some big company or other. Yeah. And you're right. That's a unique aspect of this issue. Yeah. And I think we should probably wrap it up and get back to the reporting and writing part.
All right.
So it's good talking with you, Abrahm.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to talk with you.
And maybe I'll see you again on Blogging Heads TV.
All right. Sounds good.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye.